Alright, y'all, so first leg of the Sunshine Double in the books in Indian Wells, and Jack Draper emerges on the other end, your newly minted Masters 1000 champion, going through not only the two-time defending champion Carlos Alcaraz and Holger Rune in the semis and finals, but really from match one, a very, very impressive run to the Indian Wells title. It goes a route of Joao Fonseca, who's obviously had such a breakout first quarter of this season to this point, and not to mention bookended this week as well, winning a challenger, second challenger of the year in Phoenix. But Fonseca, the ever tricky finding his footing again, Jenson Brooksby, former champion Taylor Fritz, I thought a well-playing Ben Shelton this week in general. And then, as mentioned before, Carlos Alcaraz, who, despite his recent, best of three struggles, if anything, has always brought it in Indian Wells since becoming a top player. Before he played Draper, it had been hard to come by people winning sets on Alcaraz in the desert the last almost 3 years, really. And it is Jack Draper that hands him his first loss in Indian Wells in 3 years. And then, of course, a Holger Rune that, even despite the results, suggesting a struggle for him since the Australian Open, I had been beating the drum that Australian Open run was really, really productive for him, and he looked good to me, to salvage a bit of the luster that had come off in the last year, and he certainly did that in Indian Wells. I think even though he made the semis of Cincinnati last year, I think definitely Holger's best outdoor hardcourt result of his career to this point, getting quality wins over an on-fire Tsitsipas, Medvedev, who had gotten him the last couple times they'd played, including at this venue a year ago. And Daniil has, been improving from the disastrous start to his year, the last 2-3 tournaments he's played. And Jack Draper took that Holger Rune and bullied him. Really saved his best for last in that final. I don't know that I've ever seen Jack Draper play as well as he did, especially in that first set, where Holger was basically just rendered powerless and a spectator. So yeah, overall an unimpeachably great title run for Jack Draper. And in the bigger picture, I must say, obviously, I feel like I can see what's coming down the pipeline, that I am probably like 99% going to be taking an L on Jack Draper this year. Obviously, with my predictions for this season, I did not have him even in the top 10. And admittedly, my tape on Jack Draper has been, few and far between in the last couple of years. And I would think that's on account of also why Jack hasn't seen more success earlier is, due to his health. There's been already so many injury setbacks for him so early in his career that until last year made it hard to really get any momentum going. But obviously last year won the first couple titles of the year, and then the big splash obviously was that US Open run where he was just bulldozing opponents all the way till the semifinals. And yeah, at the time I was impressed, honestly, with how he competed with Jannik Sinner, even with Sinner being in the midst of emerging as this, overwhelming force on hard courts, and that buoyed with the occasion. The conditions, humidity, I think, played a factor. Obviously, Draper got sick within the match, but in spite of all of it, he competed like a dog and, kept those first two sets as close as one could with Sinner the last couple hardcourt majors. But at the same time, I was still skeptical. I felt like de Minaur would have beaten him. At that point, de Minaur clearly rushing back a bit too early and very clearly not at 100% when Draper swept him aside as well in the quarterfinals. And yeah, I kind of just took it as, US Open breaks free for opportunity for anybody. for the better part of the last decade, with just some physical frailty settling in at the top at that point in the season. But obviously he went on to also win, until this week, the biggest title of his career, to end the season in Vienna. And from what we've heard, it was a rough end to 2023 again physically, where his hip again was acting up and, didn't allow him the best preparation into this season. And in spite of that, when the calendar is flipped, he has picked up where he left off. In fact, built upon it, still not being at his best physically, got through 3 5-setters at the Australian Open, and I think the hip flared up again for him there off of all that mileage he racked up during the tournament. And yeah, also a couple good wins in Doha, beat Berrettini after he had beaten Novak, and was able to go all the way to the finals in Doha. And then if you were watching on Tennis Channel, obviously that cast divulged that, Draper's coach felt that the beginning of Indian Wells was really the first time all year that he felt 100%. And yeah, the way he played this week versus anything that we had seen this season, where, in spite of not being 100% again, he was still putting in tremendous results. But then when that Indian Wells fortnight started, not only did he have the best wins this tournament, but he really rolled through all of them except Alcaraz. And even then, at points in time in that match, albeit Carlitos a good ways below his best in his last 2 matches in Indian Wells this year, still, Draper was overwhelming him through portions of that match. And, we've heard for the longest of time what a great athlete Jack Draper is. I remember, watching the match against Fritz at Indian Wells this year, where Jim Courier was like, I'd expect Taylor to really, have his bread buttered here in the baseline exchanges. He'll be the one with the firepower edge. Draper will be the one with the movement, the physicality edge. And while no doubt, throughout all of these matches, he showcased how adept he is on defense and, absorbed big blows from, again, you look at who he played, Fonseca, soon to be probably the biggest forehand in the sport. Fritz, best part of his game is just how automatic, hard, and heavy his ground strokes are. And yeah, in that match, it went completely opposite to how we expected it to go on paper. Draper was legitimately out-hitting Fritz in that match, firepower-wise, holding his own just fine and getting the better of the baseline exchanges. I thought Ben Shelton, second set, was just lacing his forehand, and that's really where you got to see, the defensive skills of Draper at their best. Weathering that storm in the second set in particular, Alcaraz needs no introduction, hit 113-mile-an-hour forehand in his match against Shapovalov at Indian Wells this year alone. And then again in the final, his best performance, I think, of the run. He made it look like Holger Rune and him were in different weight classes. Anything that Holger left hanging was just being crushed by the Draper forehand in particular. All signs point to, things really taking off for Draper. It really does have the skeleton for, your next lefty powerhouse, because that's another thing. The serve uses the leftiness to its fullest. It's such a hard serve to read. And yeah, when you're a lefty, all you really need is that signature can opener out wide on the ad side, which Jack certainly seems to possess. And on top of that, the forehand. This is really the closest, I thought, we've seen to a Nadal-type lefty forehand. I think Shelton, when he's on, can certainly come close, but obviously consistency there's still a ways to go. But, Draper, in such a variety of ways off the forehand side. It wasn't just bombs away like he was red hot on that wing every time he struck it. I mean, obviously it was large and in charge on finishing balls, but also, it did a tremendous job building points when it needed to. It seemed like every forehand had a purpose, more often than not pushing opponents back on the back foot, and very rarely coughing up an attackable short ball. And yeah, I mean, if this is the baseline game we get out of Jack Draper for the foreseeable future, I mean, it's obviously only onwards and upwards. But what about everybody else? I mean, let's start with the finalist, Holger Rune. Unfortunate to be on the receiving end of a peaking Jack Draper in that final. But overall, I think comfortably Holger's best showing on an outdoor hard court. I know last year he made the semifinals of Cincinnati, but other than that, it has been, few and far between the good results for Holger on outdoor hard courts. The better results have typically come indoors. And overall, up until the finals, really a very tidy run from Holger. One that affirmed, my praise for his Australian Open showing. And yeah, I mean, this was a result that was much needed, because since that Australian Open showing, he had kind of lost the good grace that he had earned. Whether fair or not, I know that he was dealing with illness, physical ailments, in between this time. But yeah, got healthy, got right back to giving good vibes this year. I mean, quality wins throughout. He played an entertaining match with fellow indoor preferring top player Ugo Humbert. Of course, halted the Tsitsipas winning streak off of Dubai in its tracks, beat him pretty comfortably. Win over Talon Griekspoor, who was coming off the win over top seed Zverev, also Medvedev in Dubai, and then beating Daniil himself, who is, improving, albeit not quite what he was, this time a year ago even. But, the notable thing there was he played such a measured, smart match, really just took advantage of Medvedev's difficulty in really putting anybody away on these, slow as molasses Indian Wells courts, where, surprisingly enough, Daniil has done quite well, now the last 3 years, despite repeatedly expressing his disdain for these conditions. But, to Holger's credit, never got impatient, and yeah, basically just used every play in the book on the established tactics, over the years that we've learned against Daniil Medvedev. But unfortunate for a Holger, as tactically flexible as he, performed against Medvedev, it was the other end of the spectrum against Jack Draper, and that is unfortunately still, all too often the reality for Holger, is that you can never really project, from one match to the next for him. Even if he looks really good at any point during a run, it's no guarantee that that's the guy that's going to show up for the subsequent match, even though, several times this tournament it did. And yeah, I've always felt with Holger that, he's really, really good at just about everything there is in tennis. But from the first time I saw him, I've kind of felt like, that forehand can be had. And, he's still in a place where he's figuring out what his identity is. So often over the years we've seen him, struggle to balance the aggression. I mean, sometimes it can be too much, other times it can be just straight up way too passive. And I do think a lot of that stems from that forehand. I mean, I think his forehand can just get a bit too spinny and drop short all too often. And boy, against Jack Draper, did it cost him, because especially in that final, I mean, Draper was running around doing whatever he wanted to open up his own forehands off of, Holger just nothing balls on his own forehand. And, when you're spinning that forehand, you'd like for it to get more depth. And, yeah, that just wasn't happening for him. And whether it was in rallies or off the return, when he had a couple half chances in the second set early on, it was already down a break, but any hope he had to get back into the match there early in the second, he needed to put better returns in play. And he got looks at second serves, but, they were just, again, nothing balls right in the middle of the court, just sat up for Draper to tee off on. And, yeah, Jim Courier on the Tennis Channel cast, was chastising him for, awful returns, I think, something along those lines, is what he said. And, I mean, yeah, situationally, too, it hurt all the more, I think, after not being able to get himself even a look in those half chances. The air went out of the building pretty quickly for him, went down a double break, and it was curtains. But, yeah, overall, despite it ending on a sour note and it being tough, clearly, for him in the ceremony, that he couldn't bring the level that he had all week in the final, it had to sting, but definitely a huge net positive tournament, obviously, for Holger Rune. And then let's talk about our early exits here in Indian Wells. On the day after his loss, in my preview for the tournament, I talked about with Kyrgios how through 3 matches this season, it has looked a little bit sad with, how bad his wrist still seems to be. Now, at the time of me recording now, that was easily, against Mackie McDonald in Miami, the best his wrist looked, all year. Even the match against GMP, I know a lot of people, his first match of this season, were taking solace in the fact that it was such a close match. But even there, for good portions of it, particularly in the second half, he looked visually hampered, hitting his forehand, his serve not as big. And the same thing, especially glaring against Bodic and the Australian Open before that, which is definitely tough. Any way you slice it, we all feel a way about Nick Kyrgios one way or the other, but, still couldn't help feeling a little bit bad for him in his matches this year with how little progress off of so much time off that it seemed to be for him. But, positive signs in that direction in the first match in Miami for sure. Alexander Zverev, it's been a very dismal couple of months for him. Really, going back to that Australian Open final, hasn't really played a very good match in there since. And as far as just Indian Wells is concerned, I mean, yeah, with that, you can probably kiss any hopes of him getting to number 1 in the Sinner suspension block. And I know that during his time in the Golden Swing in February, he was ill for a lot of it. But what I noticed in his match in Indian Wells, I don't know if it was because of the wind or something like that. Maybe with just how tight that match became, with Greek Sport playing well, and the added pressure of, a chase for number 1, I guess in quotes, a chase, adding pressure to Zverev. But in whatever I've seen of him, and this includes the Australian Open final and everything since, his forehand does seem to have reverted a little bit. I don't know if that will last, because that was something that, he has pretty much cleaned up, I would say, since, 2021. A shot that, very often used to buckle under pressure, and even outside the pressure moments, just technically could devolve into, just rolling balls in. Yeah, again, nothing balls. And of course, he still will have matches of just passivity with that shot, but I don't know, it's just kind of looked off. I want to say the first point of the third set tiebreak was, just a reflex return by Greek Sport that he barely just flailed to get in the court, and Zverev just missed it really, really badly. And obviously, it was that crazy game where Talon was serving out the match in the third, and the first, I don't know, maybe 3-4 match points that he had in this game were just straight chokes. And I was like, is he really about to do this again? Because obviously he blew the 4-0 lead to Zverev in the 5th set of Roland Garros last year, and also, had him 7-6 in the 3rd in Shanghai. And yeah, it was a couple of deuces before Zverev actually, was proactive, and it was his good play that got him out of trouble. But lucky for him, Zverev turned around in the 3rd set breaker and out-choked Griekspoor and got him over the line. And I don't know, man, Sasha has never played well in Indian Wells, and I noted that in my preview. Miami has been much, much better for him, and here comes another chance to get himself back on track since that Australian Open final. But in general, for a healthy Sasha Zverev, it has been a while since he's had a prolonged stretch like this of just poor play. Probably since the beginning of 2022. So obviously, something to keep an eye on. Probably some urgency on his end, on his camp's end, to snap out of this rut soon. On the other hand, our last early exit in Novak Djokovic, probably did want to do well. I do believe that, given he brought Andy Murray to the States for the Sunshine Double, is finally playing Miami again. First time since 2019. But yeah, he just did not have it again in Indian Wells, which he hasn't had it again since quite literally when he exited his physical prime. The last year of his physical prime, 2016, he was coming off a three-peat, and since then he has been dreadful at this event. It's gone, for a guy that's a 5-time champion, it is a remarkable phenomenon. I know 17-18 he was still injured, so, there's context there, but it is still a really funny phenomenon that this went from one of his best events to, you would have to probably say for old Novak Djokovic, his worst event on tour. There's now back-to-back lucky loser losses, and this year certainly a lot better than last year. But, even before that, 2019, the last year he was able to still play the full tennis calendar, lost to an over-the-hill Philip Kohlschreiber, and while I'm not concerned, really in the slightest, because this has become such a prominent trend for him, where everybody knows at this point, really until the Rome Masters, don't be surprised if Djokovic is upset. And as far as this particular one goes, he was atrocious out of the gates. That first set was one of the worst, that he has maybe ever played. But the rest of the way, I would say Bodek van de Zandschulp won the match more than he lost it, which may be hard to believe with, the double break scoreline in the decider. But van de Zandschulp, despite still struggling to put matches together, consecutive wins together, rather, after that, mentally wrecking Munich final 2 years ago. Since last fall, he has obviously picked up, a treasure trove of historic wins on paper. Alcaraz, his first bad, early round loss as a top player, sent Rafa into retirement, and now gets a win on Novak Djokovic at Tennis Paradise. I just thought it was really impressive the way that he regrouped, really at the end of the second, when it looked like the wheels may be falling off for him, because he went down, I think, 5-1 in the second, and got one break back, and that seemed to settle him back in. Off that reaction, after winning the second set, I think Novak clearly was engaged, but as he said, not completely comfortable with these courts. And yeah, in the third, Bodek just played the type of tennis that I have been wondering since I saw this dude in person, in 2021 at the US Open, where, of course, he made the quarterfinals, and actually was the only one who took a set off of Daniil Medvedev at that tournament. But I've been wondering since then, and that was when he was still good, for rankings-wise, of course. I mean, he had his best results from that point till Munich Final 2023. But even then, I've wondered, how does a guy that's capable of playing this way not have better results, not ranked higher? Because when he wants to be, he can play some very, very stubborn defense where, it just feels like it's so hard to get through him. And at the same time, he hits such a heavy, hard ball. Seems to love, crashing the party and playing spoiler, where, he's more prone to play his best tennis. But, of course, he turns around, immediately throws in a clunker against Cerundolo, and I'm left wondering the same thing. But as far as Novak's concerned, I'm excited to see him in Miami, since he hasn't played there since 2019, of course. But, yeah, I mean, we are very much in the zone where, Oldovic is just showing up, low risk, low reward as well, because winning a Masters for him, even if it's Monte Carlo and that just completes the triple Golden Masters, I mean, what's that really doing for him? It's like no value added. He's just lapping the field another time. And then lastly, let's talk Carlos Alcaraz. So I was of the mindset, after Rotterdam Doha, even though he won the title in Rotterdam, that it still kind of has looked like more of the same since he lost that Olympics final. Since then, we've seen some remarkable peaks like Beijing, like, that semi against Hurkacz in Rotterdam I thought was terrific. But we've also seen, quite a bit of volatility, where even for him, where the nature of his game is a little bit up and down. Even when he was operating at his best results-wise, 2022, 2023, putting together his most consistent extended stretches. Within matches, you're always going to get a little bit of up and down with him. And, I thought, like a year ago, that Indian Wells would be the event that, silences all the panic around him a little bit. And, yeah, I still believe that I think Alcaraz is going to breeze by that 5 tally of Federer Djokovic at this particular venue. And when all is said and done, I'm confident he ends the Indian Wells GOAT. Of course, that was with the tournament as is. We'll see moving forward just how much they can alter the court as they intend to. They want to make it faster, resemble Miami more. We'll see the extent, because, the climate is going to play a factor there to some extent. That desert air probably puts a cap on just how fast they can make it. But, with what the tournament's been, these conditions had, put Alcaraz in a comfort zone unlike any other. I mean, you look at even his best title runs, somewhere along the line there, a lot of the times, he was on the ropes, he was flirting with danger. Not at Indian Wells. I mean, other than the Nadal loss in 2022, he was hardly dropping sets the last 3 years at this venue, and last 2 years winning the title had actually beaten good versions of Jannik Sinner, both in relatively convincing fashion en route to the titles. No Sinner this year. I mean, I thought this should have been a formality for him. And certainly through 3 matches, it looked like exactly that. It looked like Indian Wells had set him right, because he was flawless through 3 matches. I mean, crushed an in-form coming in Denis Shapovalov. Somehow, one-upped that performance against Grigor Dimitrov, who finally was able to maintain a clean bill of health in 2025 at Indian Wells. Knock on wood, I hope that continues, because he played some sensational tennis and probably the match of the year to this point. Very, very entertaining match with him and Gael Monfils, where, on the way, he probably, I think, dislocated one of his fingers on his right hand. That, along with the twists and turns down the stretch in the third set of that match after two, top shelf shot-making sets in the first two that they split, I thought made for the best match I've seen in 2025. Even out of the old fellas, that was still just dynamo athleticism on display, shot-making on display. And how about a throwback embrace from two of the nicest, most likable guys on tour to finish? Getting sidetracked, but of course, after that, you probably felt Grigor was going to be gassed, but I didn't think he played that badly. He got his highlights in, and it was met with a 1-2 beatdown by Alcaraz. And yeah, after those two matches against Shapo and Grigor, I really was so confident that I felt like there was a better chance that Alcaraz would win the title not dropping a set than him losing to anybody. I just didn't really entertain the possibility. And yeah, his next match against Fred Cerundolo, who, played his part, especially in the second set, and really in the first, if he'd been a little bit more opportune with his break points, he could have maybe taken it, despite losing the set more convincingly than the second. But, there was still reason to be encouraged, considering I do feel in 2025 distinctly that, he hasn't done as good a job as he typically does handling, some adversity within these matches, where it may be needed for him to wrestle back control. He's let that get out of hand multiple times. Obviously, the Australian Open with a hampered Djokovic, and then also with Yuri Lehechka at Doha when he blew, I think, a 4-2 lead in the third set. Let that snowball, I think, 4 games in a row from 4-2, 40-30. And notably, he did not do that against Cerundolo, but still was able to get out in straights over a guy that, has caused a fair share of top players, quite the tussle over the last couple of years. But turns out, it wasn't just the one-off day that carried over into the next match, where he was just flat out atrocious to start that match against Draper. And, of course, he divulged after that he was so nervous and just off-kilter, he felt, by the challenge that Draper presented. And that really bore itself out. He looked totally out of sorts in that first set. You knew the response would come, but it's not like I thought that Alcaraz really, stepped up to what we're accustomed to, him being, despite the 6-0 second set. Carlos just quite simply did not need to raise that much to get that second set under his belt. Pretty early on, Draper just punted on that second set. And, yeah, that match kind of, crystallized, I think, some of Alcaraz's struggles, not only, since the Olympic final. I think, it's been hard to put into words, but over the last couple of months, I have noticed, just a bit of situational awareness that lacks with him. Maybe the most prominent ones against Novak when he had him there for the taking at Cincinnati, and the Australian Open, both in the second set where Djokovic looked dead on his feet, not going for the jugular there, letting him hang around. Somebody of, Novak's quality, caliber, experience, and, conversely, having that exact awareness to identify, exactly how a match is trending. He really made him pay for not going for the jugular both those matches. And beyond that, for somebody as great as him, I find it hard to believe that, he doesn't feel these things in matches. He doesn't have a grasp of momentum. He wouldn't be here if he didn't. But, so often I do feel like just identifying that the tide has shifted your way and playing accordingly, it doesn't really happen with him. He just plays the same speed, And yeah, I mean, anyone that's played tennis, 6-0 sets do feel like a double-edged sword unless it's the last set of the match, because it's so easy to let your guard down a little bit. And, I think early on in the third set, Draper just getting a couple holds on the board, brought him back engaged. And that's all fine. In this particular match, I thought Draper did well to get his nose ahead. When he was engaged, he was the better player in the match. That on account of Carlitos not having his best level on the day. But the issue here was, after going down the initial break, and I know there was the controversy with, Molayani initially calling the double bounce that wasn't for Draper, and he ended up hitting a winning shot on the answer. And I know some people, would not want Carlos to be so earnest that, he was not going to get the ball, but if you're watching it, he wasn't. Brought up the break point that Draper ended up converting after Alcaraz hit a drop shot, that he got to with ease. But no harm in that to me. I mean, it's good sportsmanship. He probably was not getting to the ball. It didn't seem like it did affect him getting to that redrop. But, if you were to poke holes on one thing in Jack Draper's run this fortnight, it would be that he was still prone to a couple of nerves. I mean, he was super nervous trying to close it out at the end against Taylor Fritz, and Alcaraz just needed to stay connected. I thought after he went down a break, he still had, I think, 3 more chances. Draper had to crank out like 3-4 more holds. Pretty sure 3, but 3 or 4 more holds. And, as is with any great player, you do get the feeling like as long as they stay connected to just one break, the chance is going to come at some point, in those next couple service games for their opponent. But the thing is, Alcaraz didn't do that. And, that 2-4, I think, service game with him still down the single break was just maddening to watch, because the number one objective should have been stay within a break, and he was up 40-15 in this game, and it became complicated for no reason at all. I think he hit one double fault and another unforced error to get it to deuce. He had, I want to say, like 5 or 6 game points, and to me, at least like 4 of them, including the 2 40-15 points, were just carelessly thrown away. And that's what I'm talking about here, is I feel like tennis so often is about these mini objectives, and to me, there's a little bit of lack of, smelling blood in the water for those situational instances. And I do think some of that is actually demonstrated in the fact that he's never come back down 2-0. There are a couple of instances, lesser extent the Bodic one, but when he broke back after giving up an early break down 2-0, you were like, okay, here he comes. And same way, Zverev at both Roland Garros 2022 and the Aussie last year, Medvedev as well at the US Open in 2023, how often would the big three, when that happened, you just felt the comeback was inevitable, and it would be so hard. It would take a special effort to wrestle back momentum. And, Alcaraz, I just do feel like tactically, there should be a little bit more flexibility when you identify those trends in the matches, because so often the case is when you're continuing to just play the same speed, and even if he's not doing that, just not playing in a way that's conducive to keeping the momentum going. Because with him, I have also, sensed a little bit of indecisiveness of, when he wants to play loopy, play safe, and when he wants to just go bombs away. But so often he plays in a way that, sort of gets us back to square zero, and he has to get back into the ascension all over again, which, again, he's such a great player. We've seen him so often, be able to do that. But, it makes life a whole lot more difficult than it can be. And,
yeah, he threw away that 2-4 game, and that was pretty much the nail in the coffin, and lo and behold, the chance did come for him. He broke the very next game, but 2 breaks down, it was, too little, too late. But, that being said, am I panicking for him right now? I did feel like I would be a little bit more concerned if he lost Indian Wells, because to me this title, especially No Sinner, was right there for the taking for him. Has, of course, been his favorite court, and obviously we're sitting here right now, and that did not happen. In fact, Sinner's points lead only grew over both Zverev and Alcaraz, while sidelined. And certainly I thought, flipping to a new year, that he would, shake off some of these issues that have been following him since the Olympics final and hasn't happened yet. Miami's another great chance to do it. I mean, holistically, it is hard to ignore, how much he has dropped off in Masters 1000s. I mean, this is something that we saw with, Big Three Andy Murray only after they exited their physical prime into their 30s, because you just couldn't keep up with the week-to-week grind of the tour. And post-Cincinnati 2023, I mean, his record is pretty ugly, especially away from Indian Wells. I think I saw he's 12-7 outside of Indian Wells 2024 and 2025. Lucky for him coming up. I mean, Miami has still been a good venue for him. And really, all in all, I mean, Indian Wells through Wimbledon, this is where he tends to put his biggest imprint on his seasons. And in my mind, he is too great to, not shake this off for such a prolonged stretch and, get back to winning ways. I know he won the Rotterdam title, but in a way that's reminiscent of him at his best. But yeah, I mean, in the short term, he's got to get back to, what he was. He started great in Masters tournaments. And, that really is your answer right there. His performance in Masters, of why he still holds 2 slams on his ledger within the last 52 weeks. And he is under 7,000 points right now. You can point to that exactly. But that being said, no top players in particularly good form. I still believe that, it's very doable for him to, shake this juju, get back to, where he belongs and raise that trophy in Miami. I think he will do it here as well. Less conviction in that than I had going into Indian Wells for obvious reasons. Good venue for him as well, historically, but, with it being a drastically quicker court, we have seen just last year, somebody gets hot on these, slick courts. Certainly, Alcaraz could be victim to a peaking performance a la Grigor last year, but we'll just have to wait and see. But that will do it. I have rambled long enough. I mean, do you really need my Miami predictions? That pretty much sums it up. I mean, you could see a variety of dudes, make it deep, play the final of this tournament. Jack Draper has as good a shot as, any in the last couple of years to pull the Sunshine Double. No top players right now in particularly great form. Jannik Sinner sidelined, the one, definitive lock to be there at the semis and finals, especially of a hard court event. Should be interesting to see, which of these top guys are, going to be able to work out of their funks during this event, if any. See how much opportunities presented to an outsider potentially as well. As of today, all the top men are going to be in action, or at least a lot of them. So yeah, I mean, the next week should be a lot of fun. But that'll do it for this video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, I would appreciate dropping a like, helping the video perform a lot better in YouTube's algorithm, and also subscribe to the channel if you're new around here. I will probably look to be doing like a hot take segment after Miami before we head to clay court season, and try to touch on anything, notable that happens throughout this Miami Open. But with that, thank you all again so much for watching, and of course, I will see you all in the next one.